Welcome, everybody. This is Across the Atlantic. We provide actionable insight on geopolitics at the intersection of capital markets. Today, I'm joined by Ashley Zumwalt-Forbes. Ashley is an engineer with 13 years experience in acquiring, financing, and developing both greenfield and brownfield natural resources projects around the globe. Ms. Zumwalt-Forbes formerly served as the U.S.'s Deputy Director of Batteries and Critical Minerals, overseeing the deployment of around $6 billion in non-dilutive equity and around $10 billion in tax credits into the U.S. battery supply chain. Ms. Zumwalt-Forbes has deep expertise in starting and scaling energy supply ventures, having served as co-founder and president of Black Mountain Metals, a private nickel mining company, and Black Mountain Exploration, a private natural gas company which successfully IPO'd. She was key to both the IPO and business combination of Metals Acquisition Corp, having served as its co-founder and senior advisor from 2021 to 2023. Prior to joining Black Mountain in 2017, Ms. Zumwalt-Forbes worked in several lead engineering roles at ExxonMobil and XTO Energy, managing drilling, completions, and planning aspects of international shale exploration, laying the groundwork for around and over $1 billion of capital deployment. She's on the advisory board of both TCU's Energy Institute and OU's School of Petroleum Engineering. Ms. Zumwalt-Forbes graduated summa cum laude from the University of Oklahoma with a BS in Petroleum Engineering and holds an MBA from Harvard Business School. Ms. Zumwalt-Forbes was highlighted as she was featured as an honoree in the 2020 Forbes 30 Under 30 in Energy list, a 2021 Oil and Gas Investor 40 Under 40 award winner, and one of the top 25 women in business in Dallas-Fort Worth by Dallas Business Journal. She now resides in Austin, Texas with her husband, daughter, and 2 cats. Ashley, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. I really appreciate the time.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for the introduction.
Of course. So I figure we just jump right into it, Ashley, keeping it loose conversational. I know I just gave you the background and hopefully I didn't miss anything. I know there's a lot there.
So, no, you did great. Yeah.
Right. So I always like to hear, from folks in their own words, their own background. I know obviously, as we just mentioned, you have that energy, both private and public side. So if you could just give us a little taste of what your background is in your own words, I think that'd be super helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. So in short, I love the energy business. I love the transactions behind the energy business. I like the people. I like how our world is changed for the better with an abundance of energy and really what energy across the board has been able to do. My background's oil and gas. Took a little bit of a right-hand turn into critical materials, which has just been a fantastic journey. I think, back when I started in critical materials in 2017, it was very much a niche issue. People were talking a little bit about cobalt, but across the board, there was such a lack of awareness around where things come from, what we need, what goes into end products. And it's really grown to be one of the nation's top national security concerns. So I feel very fortunate to have, over the years, built and sold critical materials companies, IPO'd and transacted on large mining resources. And it's a really fun journey. Certainly the time in government was very different than my transactional experience, but I really feel that we made such an impact in the critical materials supply chain during my time there, and just incredibly proud of the folks that I worked alongside.
Fantastic. Really appreciate that, Ashley. So, you mentioned critical and rare earth minerals. If you could just explain what exactly those are. You mentioned cobalt again. I think a lot of folks still, I would put myself in that bucket as well, still don't know a whole lot about it. I think bare bones minimum is probably my knowledge level, to be honest. So what are they? Why are they important? And what are they used for exactly in U.S. industry?
Yes, so such a great question. So great. And I really appreciate you asking. So critical materials and rare earths are different things. People often use them interchangeably. I will go through both, but as a precursor, all rare earth metals are critical materials, but not all critical materials are rare earths. Of the critical minerals, I leverage the Department of Energy list. There's also a USGS list, which is a bit larger. Nothing wrong with either one. DOE, easier to explain. There are 18 materials, and they're viewed as what is critical for energy today, as well as in the near term future, not 30 years, but 10 years, right? And within that spectrum, there is a subset of materials called rare earths. Rare earths are things like neodymium, praseodymium, terbium, things you actually don't hear a lot about. Like these
No.
are kind of strange words, right? But they're grouped together in a series of materials called rare earth metals. Traditionally, rare earth metals go into permanent magnets. Well over 90% of rare earths come out of China. And that's both from mining, processing, separation of the rare earths, and making of magnets. Now, outside of rare earths, which often get a ton of airtime because it's such a defense focus, we need permanent magnets for wind turbines, for engines, but also if you look at anything within the drone space, missiles, we need these rare earths in order to feed those technologies. Outside of rare earths, within critical minerals, there is a whole suite of, in total, there are 18 DOE critical minerals, but you can think of the rest as more electrification metals. Not all go into batteries. However, they are all important to electrification. So for example, my personal pet favorite critical mineral is copper. I love copper. I think copper is the final boss of the energy transition because we need it to distribute electricity. It is an electrification metal, not a battery metal. Then finally, rounding out our little lesson on critical minerals here, are like your classic battery minerals. So kind of the traditional formulation, I guess you can call it, is within the cathode, you have nickel, manganese, and cobalt, all of which are critical. Within the electrolyte, so moving between the positive and negative portions of the battery, you have lithium. And then in the anode, so the negative portion of the battery, you traditionally have graphite. There are others, but that's a quick primer on what are critical minerals. And
Yeah. Yeah, huge. Really good job of doing that too. I don't know if I could get paid enough to do an intro like that to both those buckets. So that's fantastic. Gosh, I really appreciate that. So, look, you mentioned China, for at least controlling a lot of like 90% ish of one of those buckets. You also mentioned a few different individual names in there, like nickel, cobalt, and the like, copper as well. So you already kind of jumped the gun on my next one. So I think we're thinking the same thing here. Ashley, so, where around the globe are these two buckets of minerals and materials located? Obviously, you said China is one of them. And then, China, of course, being a great power rival to the United States. I think that's kind of first and foremost in at least our minds, right? As Americans sitting here, and I know you're in Austin, I'm in Houston. Where else should the U.S. be looking? Where do we need to be concerned about? I know Australia's got a few. Just throwing that out, thinking off the top of my head. What are your thoughts there?
So China is very constant thematic across critical minerals. Decades ago, the Chinese government developed a strategy to really dominate this entire supply chain. And through their Belt and Road strategy, have been able to really develop resources globally. And what they've done very, very well is they take ownership stakes in the upstream resources.
Yep.
They develop relationships with the governments where these resources are, and we'll go through kind of where on the globe generally you focus on. But importantly, they have within mainland China developed all of the processing and downstream requirements for these industries. So resources are where they are, right? Like you discover a mine, wherever it may be, and you have to extract the resource there. It's not like you can pick it up, right?
Right.
So they've done a great job of consolidating that entire supply chain by centralizing all mid and downstream processes in China. Almost across the board, not just in rare earths. Upwards of 80% of most of these materials are at least processed in China. So just an enormous chokehold across the board, incredibly strategic. Now, if you look outside of China, like where are the bright spots? What can the US do to try to develop some of these supply chains? I'm actually really happy with the rhetoric around permitting reform coming out of the current administration, because we do have some critical resources here that we should absolutely be developing. We can't do it alone. Like none of this you can do by yourself. Australia and Canada are two enormous mining economies that have across the board both a wealth of minerals and also a thriving mining industry. You know, as much as like Texas is oil and gas, Australia, particularly Western Australia and Canada, are mining economies. They are our closest allies in this effort. Then you kind of start looking at, dependent on which material it is, there are obvious geographic hotspots. So the first one that comes to mind is cobalt. I think it's 85% of cobalt is mined in the Congo. It actually comes out of the Congo's copper mines. There's no such thing as a cobalt mine. It's just co-mineralized with copper or nickel. If you look at nickel, this is actually a new dynamic, completely new in the last 5 years. But Indonesia dominates the nickel space, driven by Chinese investment. If you look at things like copper, South America plays an enormous role. Lithium, South America plays an enormous role. So it really is a very, very global industry. It's reliant on not only private industry being very thoughtful around investing in exploration, getting on the front foot and developing these assets, but also our government being very strong diplomatically and strengthening ties to these nations such that the US can also secure minerals for our economy.
Yeah, 100%. And just in thinking about, and, you know, I chat a lot about this with a lot of different folks, you know, and particularly with a kind of a strategic or defensive mindset, right? And so we mentioned, and you were talking about a few of the different industries that a lot of these materials and minerals go into, defense, of course, being one of them. You talked about drones and the like. I'm sure there's also a conversation to be had around semiconductors in here as well.
Yeah.
But, you know, if we're talking that great power rivals that do not have, obviously, the US's best interests at heart, like China, Russia, and whoever else, you know, I would imagine that their utilization of supply chains of these different minerals could be used to harm US strategic interests around the globe. And again, I'm thinking specifically to the development of our own semiconductor space or, you know, defense industrial base, which I know is a focus of this administration. So, you know, in your work at the DOE, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on how these potential adversaries utilize their control of their own supply chains to harm these U.S. strategic interests.
Yes. So many of these materials are very niche commodities. So what do I mean by that? They're not traded, they're not traded on an exchange like the London Metals Exchange. So they're not big markets like copper or nickel or things that like you can just Google, what is the price of nickel today? And it's there.
Right.
They will be materials that are traded on a spot only basis, traditionally priced in China. And so, why is this important? It's important because China fully controls the pricing of these materials, and they don't need to make a profit on a quarterly basis in order to stay in operation like the West. So, let's say the US is trying to build a new rare earth. If we start thinking about what is the pricing of neodymium and praseodymium in order to make a return to attract equity investment,
Yep.
those investors have to significantly risk what that price is, fully knowing that China can manipulate that price, has historically manipulated that price
Right.
to flood the market and ensure there are not other sources of these metals. And so it prevents us, even though there is now a focus on establishing supply chains, it prevents us from establishing those because we can't attract investment and we can't make a profit on a quarterly basis, failing the Western business model.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's super interesting too. I mean, you talk about state-driven establishment, or I guess flow of capital, and then obviously our system, we have that more private flow of capital. And as you know, and again, in chatting with some folks about this, mining is a very capital intensive business. It's super not easy, for lack of all these better words out there. It's super not easy to get an asset. And again, I know you know this, but to get it up and running and then also producing. A lot of risk involved to equity investors, like you said, whereas the state via China can just forget that risk associated with the investment.
Exactly.
So super interesting. And again, at your work at the DOE, Ashley, so diversification and stabilization of these different supply chains in the U.S. economy. I have also sat down with some folks. I think Department of State, I'm going to forget exactly where they were working at, but their whole goal was to work with U.S. allies in establishing these global supply chains. Friendshoring, nearshoring are terms they threw around for sure. But if you have, any thoughts, Ashley, on how the U.S. is working with partners to establish a robust and secure supply chain of these minerals and materials, that would be super insightful.
Absolutely. So, as you and probably all of your listeners already know, we in the US have really let our industrial base deteriorate. We don't mine a tremendous amount here in the US, which means we have to get our materials from somewhere. Many of our efforts at the Department of Energy through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act were focused on the middle part of the supply chain. So being able to source minerals from somewhere, right, and process them here. It would be beautiful, wonderful, great if we could mine them here and process them here. But that wasn't the focus of Bill and I, right? But hopefully will be for permitting reform. Very passionate about it. So we were focused on the middle part of the supply chain, which is great because it creates a second pathway, an alternate pathway to China's dominance in the mid and downstream sectors. Now, the friendshoring and diplomacy efforts are of utmost importance for that strategy because we have to be able to secure minerals somewhere. Does nobody any good to spend billions of dollars setting up mid and downstream processing when we've got nothing to process, right? And it takes time to build mines. So even while we're now emphasizing and accelerating domestic assets, it'll take 10 or 20 years before we have appropriate levels of production here. So we have to rely on our friends and we have to increase diplomacy.
Fantastic. Yeah, super insightful. And Ashley, so I'm looking at the clock here, and I think we covered a lot about the supply chains, how the U.S. how we should and are growing our own domestic supply of these deposits, which is huge. So I think we move to national security implications from here, unless you have any last thoughts on how the U.S. and you talked about permitting reform. That's obviously huge. I think that's something we're definitely going to see during the next, call it 3 to 4 years. of this
I
current
have
administration? Yeah,
one
yeah,
other, I have one other soapbox that I would
please.
love here.
I'll give you the stand. It's all yours.
It's around pricing, and uh, uh, because China controls pricing of these critical materials so tightly, it makes it very hard for Western companies to raise money, build supply chains, stay in operation. I fundamentally believe that the US government needs to be one of two things: either an off taker of last resort for these operations, underwriting production at a certain pricing threshold, and either taking that material, adding it to strategic stockpiles, or selling it onwards to US companies. That's option one. What does that do? It allows projects to get off the ground. It takes risk off the table for investors. It allows projects to finance themselves without having to rely on government incentives. The second option, it does all of the same things. It's potentially a bit cleaner, but I think it would be less popular. Is the US government effectively underwriting a price floor for these materials and making up the difference between market price and that price floor such that operations can stay in perpetuity? I think that's unpopular because it's an infinite check, right? You don't know how much it will be and for how long it will last. So I like the idea of the US government taking physical custody better.
Okay. And on either of those two solutions, Ashley, have you seen any meaningful or significant progress in making either of these two things reality?
I've heard, um, I've read thought pieces coming out of some of the think tanks in DC revolving around these areas have contributed to many of them. The BPC, Bipartisan Policy Center, put out a really good piece late last year around some of this, some of these areas. I do think it's an area that it feels like something that this administration could and would do. Much more kind of commercially focused, commercial minded. So I'm hopeful that the pricing issue will be addressed.
Okay. Yeah, fantastic. And again, I just figured that you probably have better insight. And a lot of folks that watch this, I mean, you're either talking about oil and gas folks or you're talking about mining folks as well, and also some generalists out there. So thought I'd ask the question for them. I know you have great insight on this. So fantastic. Yeah. Thank you. So we talked a little bit again about the defense industry and how they use these materials and minerals. Ashley, what are your thoughts around any national, if at all? I mean, maybe there's none. But what national security concerns should Americans have, or should we just all have, if the U.S. and the collective West in general is largely just unable to establish or secure these supply chains of these critical minerals?
I am deeply troubled by that outcome, and I think everyone should be. The reality is, what we're seeing now coming out of China is export bans of specific minerals. Those export bans are directly pointed towards wounding our defense, our defense capabilities. Because we don't have a way to respond. And again, if we don't act now, it takes a decade plus to bring these assets online. So it's not something that we can just snap our fingers and come up with our just-in-time solution.
Right.
There also is not an alternative globally. So I would argue so strongly that if the US and China would, if the conflict between our nations does escalate, what would our economy do? Where would we get any fundamental building block to build anything and continue powering our economy? And so it truly is a top national security concern in my eyes.
Okay. Yeah. No, that's really helpful. Now we're talking about, I think, kind of just more hard power and access to commodities and these critical minerals as well. I want to broaden it up a little bit. And again, I know you interact with a lot of different folks. You were working
Yeah.
at Black Mountain Exploration. I know you have touched on LNG or just natural gas in general.
Yeah.
Thinking about the energy mix of the United States, obviously energy security post Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been a global concern, obviously not just for us, but for European allies, countries out in Asia as well. As you think about holistically, as you think about U.S. energy mix,
Yeah.
should the U.S. be concerned about its own energy security over the next 5 to 10 years? And before you answer, I'll just give my thoughts super quick. I mean, I think we're pretty well positioned. I could be wrong on that assumption. What we see is the U.S. Building out a lot of export facilities, specifically on LNG, going both across the Atlantic to Europe, as well as to allies and friends out in Asia. Now, that's just one source of energy. Obviously, nuclear is a mix. So I could go off on a tangent on all these different pieces, but I'll bring it back down. Ashley, should the U.S. be concerned about our own energy security over the next 5 to 10 years?
We absolutely need to keep our foot on the gas for an all of the above energy solution. And I think an amazing outcome would be for the US oil and gas industry to be able to fuel the world in the near term, right? Particularly from a natural gas perspective. We have tremendous oil and gas reserves in this country. And so I personally love that we are both now exporting LNG and looking to ramp that up. I think it certainly helps our European allies in reducing their dependency on adversaries. And it's a great strategic advantage of ours. We talk about, we really don't mine much in the US. Something we do really well is we drill for and produce oil and gas. And so we should continue doing that. We should do that for ourselves. We should do that for our friends. And we should collect that money.
Yeah, 100%. I totally agree. And now you mentioned an all of the above solution. Obviously, that it just kind of inherently insinuates renewables, which again, I think is, it's an energy expansion, right?
Absolutely.
Which is
Yeah.
great. And I'm going to parlay this with a conversation about China as well. A lot has been made. I mean, you could look on Bloomberg, Wall Street Journal, take your pick of, the article where it's coming from about
Yeah.
China's pivot to renewables, including nuclear energy as well. My own thoughts on this is that there's probably some, it's not so much China as being a standard bearer for renewable energy. There's probably a conversation in there around China is the largest importer of energy globally. So they're trying to insulate themselves from any geopolitical volatility. Those are just my thoughts, but do you have any pressing thoughts or issues on why China is so aggressively pursuing these alternative energy sources?
I think it's exactly what you just said is they're very strategic about being able to play to their strengths. And like, I wish all of us would be so smart, right?
Right.
And be able to insulate themselves from any sort of unwanted foreign influence. Like they very much are building their economy and their foreign strategies to insulate themselves and be a leader. And so yes, I think much of that pivot is simply a hedge on, if there is a conflict going forward, how does their economy continue going? And I think they've done a really good job of insulating themselves.
Fantastic. Appreciate that. Now, Ashley, and again, I'm looking at the clock. I know you got a lot going on. So before I let you go here, are there any last soapboxes you want to go off on critical minerals, materials, anything like that? And if not, would love to, get your not thoughts, but would love to get, an idea of where folks can find you, what you're working on currently, and what is new with Ashley Zumwalt-Forbes.
Yes. Look, my final soapbox. I have many soapboxes. This is something you'll come to learn about me, but I'll air one more here. And based on your body of work, on the line of questioning, I know you know this. I'm really hopeful that all listeners here know this and are actively learning more. But when I'm raising money the one of the biggest areas of feedback that I get is, oh, I actually can't invest in mining, or I can't invest in upstream oil and gas because it's dirty. But I invest in the end products. Those are considered clean. And this drives me crazy. I think if you're not investing in upstream assets, you are burying your head in the sand and you're not able to influence outcomes. Like if you're investing in those, you can clean up those operations. Like you have the ability to pull those levers. If you're just a buyer, um, like can't influence anything, and in fact are completely reliant but have no ability to actually drive change. So I would really advocate for the capital allocators out there to really think long and hard about the entirety of the supply chain and how you can make a difference.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Thank you, Ashley. Again, if you want to let the people know where to find you, what you're working on, and what is new with Ashley Zumwalt-Forbes.
Yes. Look, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. I'm confident I'm the only Ashley Zumwalt-Forbes. So if you find someone named Ashley Zumwalt-Forbes, it's probably me. Decent chance. Always happy to chat critical minerals. I am currently on a 3-month break. I promised my husband I would take some time off. As you can see, I would say time off is mixed results. But you'll be seeing me popping back up in the critical minerals M&A space here in a couple of months.
I'm very excited, very much looking forward to that. I also like all of your LinkedIn posts, so I highly recommend everybody go follow her out there, as well as anywhere else. So, Ashley.
All my soapboxes, I get to air them.
Fantastic. Well, Ashley, again, thank you so much for your time. Cannot thank you enough. So really appreciate you sitting down with me here.
Happy to do it. Thanks, Garrett.